All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books presents award-winning photographer Andrew Feiler, who will discuss his new book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. Today, Feiler will be in conversation with the curator of African art at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Tate Baeza. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Andrew and Lauren, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or all of your friends at left-bank.com. We did just receive copies today, so even though when I share the link, it will not say that they are on our shelves now, they are on our shelves now, and that will be absolutely accurate once the website updates. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I'm Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event. So you can type your questions as a comment at any point in time throughout the event. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook or YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have a ton of incredible events lined up for May and for the rest of the year, so be sure to check those out. About today's book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. This is a Sarah Mills Hodge Fund publication. Born to Jewish immigrants, Julius Rosenwald rose to lead Sears, Roebuck and Company and turned it into the world's largest retailer. Born into slavery, Booker T. Washington became the founding principal of the Tuskegee Institute. In 1912, the two men launched an ambitious program to partner with Black communities across the segregated South to build public schools for African American children. This watershed moment in the history of philanthropy, one of the earliest collaborations between Jews and African Americans, drove dramatic improvement in African American educational attainment and fostered the generation who became the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. And I will let Andrew fill in the rest of the details, but it is particularly interesting because there is one remaining school in Missouri, so that is of particular interest to everyone watching from St. Louis. And now I will read the blurbs because there is so much praise for this book. Congressman John Lewis says, Andrew Feiler's photographs and stories bring us into the heart of the passion for education in Black communities. The passion of teachers who taught multiple grades and dozens of students in a single classroom. The passion of parents and neighbors who helped to raise the money to build our schools, and then each year continued to reach deep to purchase school supplies. The passion of schools like me, the passion of students like me who craved learning, worked hard, and read as many books as we could put our hands on. And Jill Savitt, the president and CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, says, Andrew Feiler's photographs preserve an essential civil rights history with the inspiring story of the Rosenwald Schools. And this history continued through the descendants of the schools and their creators, including the late John Lewis, Edgar Evers, and Maya Angelou. At a time when racial inequality in education remained a scourge, Feiler's book provides context and hope. And now I will introduce Lauren. Lauren Tate Baeza joined the High Museum of Art in November 2020 as the Fred and Rita Richmond Curator of African Art. Baeza oversees the African art collection of more than 1,000 objects, including extraordinary examples of masks and sculpture, exceptionally fine textiles, beadwork, metalwork, and ceramics. The collection's holdings reflect the continent's deep, rich history as well as contemporary innovations. As an Atlanta native, Baeza is a curator and Africanist with a background in international aid organizations and museums. As a scholar, she has researched African political and economic phenomena through the lens of cultural geography, specifically examining the spatial history of food, culture, and artistic practices within the continent and across the Atlantic. Prior to joining the High, Baeza served as Director of Exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights from 2018 to 2020. During her tenure there, Baeza maintained the center's two ongoing installations in its American Civil Rights Museum, Civil Rights Movement, and Global Human Rights Movement galleries, and organized 16 contemporary exhibitions and installations, including Fragments, a collaboration with celebrated designer Paula Scher, featuring passages from Dr. King's handwritten speeches and letters. Baeza holds a Master's of Art in African Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, a Bachelor of Arts in Africana Studies with a Cultural Studies concentration from California State University, Northridge, and a certification in Curatorial Studies from Sotheby's Institute of Art. And now I will welcome both Lauren and Andrew, and Lauren will introduce Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was very thorough.
It's really so great to have you both here today. So
thank you. And I also want to say, as you mentioned, I'm at the High Museum currently and was previously at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is actually the place that will premiere a solo exhibition of the photographs in Andrew's book this month. And now I'll read Andrew's bio, and I'll let him after that sort of give us a quick overview of sort of the content of this book. Andrew Feiler is a fifth-generation Georgian. He grew up Jewish in Savannah, Georgia, and was shaped by the rich complexity of the American South. Andrew is active in civic life, helping to create more than a dozen community initiatives, serving on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations, and advising elected officials and political candidates. His creative practice and photographic works are an extension of his civic values. Andrew's photographs have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, Slate, Lynn Scratch, Oxford American, The Bitter Southerner, among other magazines and outlets. And his newest book of photography that we'll be discussing today, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America, has already received numerous honors. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Lauren. It is great to share this stage with you. I would simply say that Lauren is among the earliest supporters of this work. She saw this project well before, while it was in the midst of being shot. There are 85 photographs in this book. I think, Lauren, you saw this work when it was at about 40. And it was her enthusiasm that this will come to the Center for Civil and Human Rights when she was still a curator there. In fact, this exhibition will open May 22nd. It will be up through the end of the year, and then it will travel across the country. And so I'm grateful, Lauren, to you for kicking off that tremendous aspect of this journey. This has been an extraordinary journey. This book came out April 1st. It has been 10 days ago. There was this just beautiful, artful two-page spread in the Wall Street Journal. It is in Smithsonian Magazine. Either of those are major life events for a photographer. So it's just been incredibly gratifying. And I found out today, this is breaking news for those of you who are on this, the book as of today is into its third printing. So
congratulations.
I am grateful to how extraordinarily beautifully this work has been received. So thank you. So let me, I'm going to start and then I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but I'll just start with a premise. The Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments of the first half of the 20th century in America. It transforms the United States. It transforms the African American experience, and yet its history is largely unknown. Certainly the scope and sweep of this history is largely unknown. So let me, I'm going to share screen here and show some photographs. There we go. Whoop. Sorry, I was in the wrong place there. Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in Bartow County in North Georgia. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants in Springfield, Illinois. They had left Germany because of religious persecution. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln while Lincoln was resident in Springfield. And he goes on to become the leader of Sears, Roebuck and Company and leads the company he turns Sears into the world's largest retailer, and he leads Sears, Roebuck and Company from 1908 until his death in 1932. And he becomes—
Andrew, I'm sorry, Andrew. The share screen is not quite working yet. So let's go ahead and try that again.
Let's see.
Sorry, I wanted to interrupt before we got too far into the into the presentation.
Now I'm going to do share screen again. Share screen. Okay. And then I will. You seeing it now?
Not yet.
Let's see, choose. Oh, okay. I just figured out the step that was missing.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. Everything okay? Everybody see all that? You see that okay, Shane? We good?
Yes, it's up and going.
Okay. So, Julius Rosenwald. So this is this portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. One of the 4,978 Rosenwald schools. And so he's born to Jewish immigrants. He grows up in Springfield across from Abraham Lincoln's home. While Lincoln is resident there, he ends up in Chicago, and he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. The other significant protagonist in this story is Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, who is one of the most prominent African-American voices of the late 19th and earliest 20th centuries, becomes an educator and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, known as Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. And this portrait of Booker T. Washington hangs in the president's home at Tuskegee University. Now, the two men meet in 1911. This is a rare portrait of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at that rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt. So the two men meet in 1911. You have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration. So which doesn't begin until later that decade. And so 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided to the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so they create this program, and they reach out to the African American communities of the South, and they say, we want you to be a full partner in your progress. So we ask that you contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, labor, and material. And we ask that you reach out to the school board, the white school board, because these will be public schools. And while we invite their contribution, at a minimum, the public school system must agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you will do those things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And from 1912, when the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama, begins to raise funds for this first, what becomes the very first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when President Franklin Roosevelt, presides over the dedication ceremony of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. This program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And the program transforms America. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. But between World War I and World War II, that gap closes precipitously. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of what the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, and Congressman John Lewis, who wrote this absolutely glorious introduction to my book, in which he describes his very first day in what is the Dunn's Chapel Rosenwald School in Alabama. Congressman John Lewis went to a Rosenwald school. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with a preservationist named Jeannie Syriac, and the story shocked me. I'm a 5th-generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story, Southern, Jewish, progressive, activist, literally are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I come home and I Google Rosenwald schools, and I find that there are a couple of books on the subject, but there has not been a comprehensive photographic account of this story. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over 3.5 years, I drove more than 25,000 miles across all 15 program states. And of these original 4,978 schools, about 500 remain. Only half of those have been restored. And I shot 105 of the surviving schools. This is the Emory School, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school, built around 1915 in Hale County, Alabama. It's what's known as a one-teacher school. I also found 2-teacher schools. This is the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, where we started, because this is the school inside of which hangs this portrait of Julius Rosenwald. 3-teacher schools. This is the Pleasant Plains School in North Carolina. Note, these are 1, 2, and 3-teacher schools that are all small, white, clapboard structures. By the time you get to the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. Now, this is the one surviving Rosenwald school in the state of Missouri. I'm going to digress for a second here just to talk about the Rosenwald Schools program in Missouri, because it seems like a little bit of an outlier. But the state school superintendent reaches out to the Rosenwald program in 1925 and requests to be part of the program, and is turned down. So in 1928, he writes directly to Julius Rosenwald, and he says, there are 50,000 African-American children in the state of Missouri, and their educational state is, to use his word, deplorable. We've got to be part of this program. And in 1929, they joined the program, but they, of course, joined the program very late, because the heart of the program largely is from 1912 to 1932. The last school was built in 1937, but all of the other schools, that part of the program ends in 1932. So this is 1929. They only end up building 3 schools in Missouri. This is the only surviving one. It is on the campus of Ozarks Technical College in Springfield, Missouri. And it is the health occupation classrooms where they teach nurses and other nurse practitioner type careers. So of the remaining 500 Rosenwald schools, only about half of which are restored, but very few are still in use as educational purposes. This is actually a rare example of a Rosenwald school still in use for educational purposes. But most, in order to be restored, had to have been adaptively reused. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters, who raised money to who sold quilts to raise money to restore the Pleasant Hill School and to turn it into the community center that it is today. And the women gather most Mondays in this community center in this former Rosenwald school to quilt. Others have been turned into church halls. Some are museums. This is this beautiful restoration of the Warfield School in South Guthrie, Tennessee, with this beautiful photograph of Abraham Lincoln on the wall. But many remain unrestored. And in fact, in the course of this journey, I came across schools that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency metal fencing or yellow caution tape. So there is an inherent plea in this story, the plea for preservation, because each of these buildings, each of these structures is a source of memory and history and story. And it's hugely important that we preserve these precious historic resources. But the emotional heart of this story was the people that I met. This is Frank and Charles Brinkley, former students in Rosenwald Schools, who go on to become educators. And they stand here in this school in Cairo, Tennessee, under an original portrait of Julius Rosenwald that first hung in the school when it opened in 1923. I also met former teachers. This is Ellie Damer, whose husband was an activist in the civil rights movement and was murdered for his activism. She attended a Rosenwald school, a different Rosenwald school, and then came and was a teacher in the Bay Springs School in Kelly Settlement outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I'm going to end on the story of the Hopewell School. This, in the center of this photograph, this is inside the school. In the midst of restoration, you see the plastic on the floor, the primer layer down on the walls, plastic wraps the potbelly stove on the right. In the center of this image is a portrait from the 19th century of Sophia and Martin MacDonald, both of whom were born into slavery. And upon emancipation, Martin MacDonald begins to raise farm animals. He acquires some land, he acquires some more land, and he eventually amasses 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program comes to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donates 2 acres of land for the school. Their first teacher is their daughter. One of her students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this beautiful portrait of her grandparents. Her husband on the left, Elroy Williams, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. The two of them go away, go to college, and come back to Bastrop County and have an entire career as educators and have been leading the effort to raise the funds and to actually restore the school and turn it into both a community center and a museum. This is students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of the flame of history and memory. I found that time and time again on this journey. Now, this is a book of photographs, but this is also a book of stories, like this story that I just told. And so I came across so many unbelievable stories that I felt compelled to write these stories. And there's a story that goes with every photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs, because I found Rosenwald Schools connected to the Trail of Tears, to the Great Migration, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to Tuskegee Airmen, to the litigation of Brown v. Board. And I hope that you'll spend time with these photographs, but I also hope that that you've spent time with these stories, because I think you'll find them moving. I think you'll find them inspiring, and I think you'll come away a little bit more optimistic for the prospects of positive change in America. I'm going to end with a reflection on the title of this book, A Better Life for Their Children. Julius Rosenwald, in his endeavors with this program, was seeking a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was seeking a better life for his children. The African American communities that dug deep that were already being taxed to pay for white schools and dug deep to help make these schools possible, they were seeking a better life for their children. And collectively, they changed this country and they changed the world. And I think the simple message is that our individual actions matter and they can bring positive change. Congressman Lewis writes in his introduction to this book that each of us has an obligation, a mission, and a mandate. That when we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I will close with Congressman Lewis's most fervent call. May we all find a way for the making of good trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Andrew.
Thanks for being here with me.
Of course. Okay. Shall we begin? I have some questions.
Sure.
I'm, of course, always interested in the artist's journey. So before I begin to ask some questions that more directly relate to the content in the book and the photographs, I'd like to first ask what prompted its creation. You spoke a little bit about a lunch meeting you had with Jeannie, but how did this series come about? Like, what was the first spark? If there was one before that, or if it slowly happened over time, I'd love if you would share for us how this journey evolved for you, the journey of creating this photographic series.
So I've been a serious photographer most of my life, but about 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and graciously being taken more seriously. And my first photography book came out in 2015, and it was a portrait of an largely abandoned college campus that uses this idea of abandoned education spaces to talk about the role that education has played as the backbone of the American dream. America's commitment to public education goes all the way back to 1644, when we have the first publicly funded school in America. And there's a direct connection between that, land grant colleges and HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities created in the 19th century, Rosenwald Schools in the early 20th century, the GI education provisions of the GI Bill, Brown versus Board of Education. And now what are we talking about today, right? College affordability, crushing levels of student debt. This 376-year tradition is a tradition at risk. And as you read in the beginning, my work is an extension of my values. I was trying to figure out what I would do next when I met Jeannie. And the Rosenwald Schools story is an integral part of that story that I already found absolutely fascinating. The central role that education plays as the on-ramp to the American middle class. I knew it was an amazing story, but how do you tell it visually? And so there are two aspects of that part of this journey. One is I started with exteriors, and I would drive across North Carolina and I would line up Rosenwald Schools and I would shoot them all the way up and all the way back. And but what I realized was that the story, that was the architectural narrative, and that was incomplete. So what I ended up layering on is the interiors to tell the adaptive reuse narrative. And that suddenly I need permission. So I had to find people associated with these schools, and that's how I encountered these former students and former teachers and the preservationists that were working to save these schools. And they become the emotional heart of this narrative. And so I layered on the portraits. But I'll add one other thing. Early on, I showed a portrait in my presentation of a photograph of students and teachers standing out in front of their schools. And my process is to read and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. And early on, I came across this unbelievable story. The Rosenwald Schools program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all near Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on. And he has photographs taken of these students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, and he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, and Rosenwald writes back, he is so moved by these images that he is going to expand the program. And these images of students and teachers out in front of their schools become a part of the history of this program. They become part of the visual language of this program. And because of that momentous intersection of history and photography, all of my previous bodies of work had been in color. I decided this body of work would be in black and white, and all images horizontal, because that is the visual language of these images that are part of that history. And so that's what inspires what becomes this body of work.
Thank you for sharing that. And so if you could just tell us a little bit more about sort of what Rosenwald Schools were responding to. Tell us about the options for education that existed for African Americans after Reconstruction. You mentioned in your presentation that there were many districts that simply had no public schools. What did they do instead?
So after the Civil War, there's an organization created, actually still during the Civil War, there's an organization created by the federal government that becomes known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And they build schools across the South. And there are these incredibly moving stories of people of all ages, young and old, walking for miles to get to these schools to get an education. And you see the power and the importance of that. Because remember, during slavery, in most states, literacy was literally outlawed. And so the people are crowding into these schools. And the immediate imperative is actually to train teachers so that they can create an education infrastructure. Well, the election of 1876 comes along, the Compromise of 1877, the South withdraws, Reconstruction ends, and Jim Crow begins to set in, and these schools are shut down. And so there are most of the schools that serve African Americans have been created by the African American community. They're in churches, they're in other buildings in the communities. But public schools are, to the extent that there are public schools, they are shacks. And of course, even well into the mid part of the 20th century, the materials are hand-me-down materials that come from the white school. In fact, John Lewis talks about how in his books, the names of the white children that had the books before they were handed down to the black children are still inscribed in those books. So that was the state of public education when the Rosenwald Schools comes along.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't think that even among historians that, talk about the Compromise and what happened after Reconstruction, I don't know that I've ever really understood that Freedmen's Bureau had building these schools as an extension of its services, and that was another thing taken away.
Yes.
With the Compromise.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So they had this opportunity and then had it taken away. It wasn't like they never had it.
Right.
It's worse in a way. They feel the pain of loss because they had it for a moment, very brief moment.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, there's a Rosenwald School in my book in Easton, Maryland, which is in Talbot County, which is where Frederick Douglass is born into slavery. And a Freedmen's Bureau school is built on this site. And he goes to this site in 1893, and he gives a speech. And at this point, remember, he is a former slave. He has educated himself. He has become an ardent abolitionist, and then he becomes an official of the federal government. And he has risen to high public office. And he comes back and he says to the students, pay attention to your education. That is your path forward. And the speech is so powerful that 2 years later, when he dies, that speech is quoted in his obituary in the New York Times. Well, that school ages and is decrepit, and the community petitions the Rosenwald Fund to fund its replacement school. And the school that is on that site today, which has actually been converted to apartment, is the Rosenwald School that replaced that original Freedmen's Bureau school.
Wow. So I am going to talk a little bit about the built aspect of what you documented here. The series, of course, as you mentioned, and as your presentation displayed, covers so many areas. It tells stories of the people and the communities impacted by Rosenwald Schools. It importantly reveals lesser known aspects of Southern American history and postbellum racial politics in America. And it documents the built environments that house these important spaces for learning. And because you thoughtfully capture images of these buildings, the series is part architectural survey. I know you kind of mentioned in the book that Andrew Freeman's Architecture Double series was among the influences that you had for your own series. So if we could just take a beat to talk about the architecture part, and if you could tell us more about who designed Rosenwald Schools and what some of the specs and core design principles were for those buildings, I think that would be really fascinating to hear about.
So I'm going to go back on and share screen then in order to let me see if I think I can do this better this time. Share screen. Share. Okay. So actually, I'm going to show you a different image. Is that seeing okay? Lauren, does that show up okay?
Yes.
Okay. So some of y'all will recognize this portrait. This is Valerie Jarrett, who was a principal aide to President Obama for the entire time in the White House. She is holding up a sheet of stamps with a portrait of Robert Robinson Taylor, her great-grandfather. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT and the first accredited African-American architect. And he becomes the chief architect at Tuskegee. When this program starts, he leads a design team with a mission of demonstrating progressive era architecture for education. This is architecture in the service of education. And he lays out these principles. I showed earlier the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama. This is inside of that school. And it's the progressive era design principles that are laid out by Robert Robinson Taylor and his team are evident in this space, and they become the principles that literally last through the entire program. Very large 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light, because originally these schools did not have electricity. Cloakrooms on the right, so the dirty outer garments could be kept safe out of, so that they would not dirty the education spaces. Potbelly stoves that vent through brick piers to keep the spaces cool, warm in the summer months, warm in the winter months. The windows open to keep the spaces cool in the summer months. And you see this dividing wall. There was a series of doors that would be retracted to close off to separate these two classrooms, but they could be pulled back so that the entire space could be unified and used for communities as a community center after hours. So that's built, this idea of schools as community and their linkage to community is built in from the very beginning. But I'm going to show you one more school to tell a related story. The design idiom of the Rosenwald Schools was simplicity. And it was simplicity for two reasons. Number one, to save cost. But number two, so as not to attract the ire, otherwise known as arson, from the white citizenry. And so, but occasionally, the African-American community that is actually building these schools exercises agency. And in Pleasant Plains, North Carolina, they wanted a cupola. And they built a cupola. Now, the Rosenwald Fund hated cupolas because one of their architectural leaders felt that a cupola was reflective of church architecture, and its presence on a schoolhouse violated the separation of church and state. They hated cupolas. But I will tell you, they reflect agency in the African-American community. And in the 105 schools I went to, 3 of them had cupolas. That is the voice of agency by the African-American community that builds these schools. So let me come off of share screen now. But just to go back to your question, the last thing I'll simply say is most of these schools are these small, modest, white clapboard structures. But by the end of the program, they're realizing that, like, oh, this is like going to be around for a while. And so they actually start incentivizing brick construction. So at the end of the program, they're building 1-, 2-, and 3-story red brick buildings. And it's why the Lincoln School in Springfield, Illinois still survives, because it's a 2-story building.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if it was more of a geography response, or the materials that were local, or if it was just a timeline change. Because I did notice that some of the schools, I feel like I made note of, I believe it was the Dunbar School and the Peck School, and I think they're both in Florida, looking
Right.
so different from the schools.
Well, so that's a really interesting story. So
okay.
What Lauren? Okay, let me go back to share screen and bring this back up, and because it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I was wondering why they all look different in the stories that those told, right? It's the different approaches based on environment or the needs of a community, or just simple, like you said, the time's changing and people realizing these schools need to last. And so they're using different materials because now they have a different sort of scope and purpose for those schools. Yeah, if you could
I'm looking.
Any patterns you noticed as you were documenting these schools for 3.5 years across landscape and time?
Oh, here we go. Here's the Dunbar School. Okay, let me go back to share screen. Share screen. Share. This is the Dunbar School, and so what happens? This is in Lee County, Florida, outside of Fort Myers. This is the only Rosenwald school that I know of that has mission architecture. Why does it have mission architecture? Because they had just built a brand new school for the white community, and to save money, they used the same architectural plans. So that's why you get this really unusual school in this particular case. And then, as Lauren was saying, across the state of Florida, this is the Peck School on Amelia Island. Again, later in the program, where they actually are creating an incentive to for brick construction in order to ensure that the buildings will endure.
It looks so different.
Yeah.
Thanks for expanding on that a little bit. And then I was going to say to you, which is so quick, to keep your share screen on, because I can ask this last question. I think
sure.
you might want to share your screen on this last one. And before I continue to ask you questions, I actually want to also tell our audience to start sending in questions, because I only have about 2 more for Andrew, and then we're really anxious to hear from you all. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and write them in, and we'll get to you in just 2 more questions from me. So the question I wanted to ask you, where you might want to share your screen, Andrew, is, I have some favorites. I'm personally really interested in decay and watching buildings fall apart and watching buildings be salvaged, and like which pieces remain, when you can go into a site of a building that is in disrepair and see that there were attempts to fix it at different timelines based on what you see at the site and what type of materials are being used. I'm like completely fascinated with this. And usually my research around ruins of buildings is related to how environmental change is impacting built environments. But it's no surprise for me that those were some of my favorite photographs, the photographs of the buildings that are just like what's left, right? There's something about that gives you a really great story as well. Why weren't they preserved? Why were some attempted to be conserved at some point? Those are always really fascinating to me. And there's also a material story usually, again, with regard to what's left and what's not, that I find fascinating. And another one of my favorite photographs, there's a photograph in the book of the textbooks. And it's like the McGuffey's electric reader and like the Harvey's elementary grammar books. And I thought, wow, what incredible archival things to find at the sites. I mean, I'm sure that was unexpected and such a pleasant thing to come across. Some of the old textbooks is what I'm referring to, audience, that were actually used at the schools. Andrew found some of those and has a beautiful photograph of them in the series. So what are some of your favorites?
Is that, I just want to make sure that was on the screen. This is you seen the textbooks now?
No, I can't see your share screen.
Oh.
But those photographs are beautiful. Hopefully you can pull them up here.
Is that okay? Sorry, I thought. Okay, yes. So, yeah, I mean, this was at this point in the photographic narrative, right? I'm doing exteriors, I'm doing interiors, I'm doing portraits, and I end up in this Warwick School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. They have this wonderful restoration, and the community has brought in all of these artifacts, right? Books and attendance record. And they have a memoir of one of the former teachers in this school. And she says, yeah, we taught reading, writing, arithmetic, but what we really taught was comportment. How one conducts themselves in civilized society. And one of the things about the teachers in these schools that is really important when you think about civil rights and education is that these teachers were teaching equality. They were and they were teaching democracy. They were teaching the expectation that equality and democracy were part of America. And that also helped set the groundwork for the civil rights movement. But these books are beautiful in their own right. And then here's an interior one with this just beautiful, like engraved articulation of the alphabet back when they taught script. And so, yeah, these are some of the. It was really fun to be able to add these images and storytelling.
They really help with the storytelling. So I was sharing my favorites because I wanted to hear what yours were. And really what I'm asking is, what are some of your favorite stories, right, that are represented by the photographs?
Right.
And maybe you have a story that you haven't been able to tell in this book because there just wasn't room in this iteration of the series, or maybe there's a more complexity to a story than you had sort of the bandwidth to detail in your book. We'd love to hear which moments were some of your favorites.
Yeah. So do you see the image here with Leslie Parks Bailey?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to so this is a story of Rosenwald Schools. But there's another aspect of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy that was so impactful that I felt I needed to tell it in this project. And that was a program that started in 1928 and lasted until 1948, called the Rosenwald Fellowships, where they gave grants to African-American intellectuals and creatives over that 20-year span. And it is literally a who's who of African-American intellectual leadership in the 20th century. Elaine Locke, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes,
Wow.
Jacob Lawrence, and Marian Anderson. It goes on and on and on. And Gordon Parks is the first photographer who is awarded a Rosenwald grant. Well, Gordon Parks has been sort of one of the central photographers who have been inspirations for my work, because it was Gordon Parks more than any other photographer, I feel, who demonstrated this idea that art can be a form of civic activism. I mean, and as he famously said, his camera was his choice of weapon. And I first saw Gordon Parks's work at the Corcoran Gallery in the 1980s in Washington when I was in college. I have followed his work my entire life. I had the great privilege of meeting Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was out talking about his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. And I come to Atlanta, Georgia, and it turns out that now my wife and I are friends with his daughter, Leslie Parks Bailey. So I said to Les, had this conversation with Leslie and said, I want to tell your father's story in the course of to bring the Rosenwald Fellowships program into this story. And I'm thinking about having you with a photograph taken by your dad. And she puts me in touch with the Parks Foundation, and they send back this photograph in a digital form. And they say, how about this? Self-portrait by Gordon Parks. It was part of his application to be a Rosenwald Fellow. And I'm like, wow, that'll work. And so just the last piece of this I'll say is I was thinking about how I wanted to do this. And one of Gordon Parks's seminal bodies of work was a photo illustration he did of the novel Invisible Man. And in the photo illustration, the character is shown popping out of a manhole cover. And so it was an homage to that partnership between Ralph Ellison and Gordon Parks, and that photo series that I have Leslie sitting on a manhole cover.
Yeah, it's not surprising that's one of your favorites, and it's a bit meta, right? Like you're sort of continuing this legacy of using photography as an extension of civic engagement.
Right. That's exactly right.
It's incredible. Last question before we hear from our audience. If you could tell us a little bit about how Rosenwald Schools intersect with the Trail of Tears, the displacement of Indigenous Americans, and land use policy. You mentioned it briefly, I think, at the top of the book, but if you could expand on that, I think that would be really illuminating.
Yeah. So this is the Rosenwald School in Lima, Oklahoma. And if there's a story that caused me to say I had to share what I was learning, it was the story of this school. Almost everybody has heard of the Trail of Tears. It was the displacement of 5 Native American tribes who lived east of the Appalachians to what is now eastern Oklahoma. What I certainly did not know was that those 5 Native American tribes had slaves, and they took them with them on their journeys west. And when emancipation comes in 1865, these freed African Americans, for economic reasons and security reasons, form all Black townships in Oklahoma, 50 of them. And they actually send recruiting agents across the South to encourage people to come to this promised land.
Wow.
11 of these all Black townships have Rosenwald schools. Rosenwald Hall in Lima is the last surviving one of those schools. And in fact, of the 50 original all Black townships, only 13 survive. And so that's just an illustration of just the amazing intersection of how woven this story is into the fabric of American history.
Yeah.
I felt compelled to tell these additional stories, and it's just it's a wonderful part of this journey, and it's
Wow.
an amazing part of it.
That's a truly American story. And I'm writing notes. I'm like, 50 all Black townships. I have homework.
So I'll add this. Toni Morrison's novel Paradise is set in the all Black townships. She tells the story of the all Black townships through her novel, one of her most celebrated novels.
And how many of these townships they ended up having Rosenwald schools?
There were 50 all Black townships, 13 survived. 11 of the all Black townships have Rosenwald schools, only one survives.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. And I think Shane is now going to moderate some questions from the audience.
I'm just fascinated by this discussion, and thank you for sharing all these incredible photos. Lauren, your questions were amazing, and I'm so happy to have been in the background of this conversation.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled with the amount of information that I absorbed during that hour. A reminder to the audience that books are available, just arrived and are available for sale at Left Bank Books, left-bank.com. And I did share a link in the comments as well, that I will share again here in a moment. I have several questions as well, but I'm happy to have the very first audience question come from Vivian Gibson, who is a local author. She is a St. Louis author of Last Children of Mill Creek in attendance. We just did an event with her on Sunday, and happy to have her in the audience for this one. So hi, Vivian. And also of note, Vivian's grandparents or great-grandparents founded an African-American school. I think it was her grandparents, but I'll let Vivian maybe put that information in the comments. So Vivian Gibson is, how were the locations for the school made or picked, or I'm curious to know about that.
Yeah, so you got to remember the message goes out to the African American communities of the South. If you will contribute to a school, and we will take as your contributions money, cash, labor, material, and land, then you have to go to the white school board. So there's two preconditions. The Black community has to play ball and the white community has to play ball. So first of all, that narrows things down. But then secondly, there's various stories of how it then comes about. So for example, there's a number of Rosenwald schools that happen to be next to churches, because obviously the churches would come together. The church members would raise the funds to donate that piece of land. There are others where we actually know who donated the land. And so, for example, there's a school in South Carolina called the Hope School. The state school superintendent in South Carolina was a man named Hope. He believed in Rosenwald schools such that every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools. The Hope School, he sells for $5 2 acres of land for this school. Even back then, that was effectively a donation. And I bring that story up intentionally because if you go to the African American Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., you will find from the Hope School, which is now restored, six school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. But so it varies by community and the circumstances of how the white community and the Black community came together to make these schools happen.
Vivian clarify it. It was her great-grandmother that started a school in Northport, Alabama. My question for you is, you mentioned both that there were kind of communities that were surrounding these schools and also that students had to walk long distances. And I'm wondering if the schools helped build communities surrounding them, if you found that in your research, or if they had to continue to travel great distances to get their education.
So most of these schools were these smaller 1, 2, 3, 4 teacher white clapboard structures. And that is because they served a relatively small area because people walked to school. So there are a lot of counties that had multiple Rosenwald schools. Newberry County, South Carolina had 26 Rosenwald schools. There's one county in North Carolina that had more than 80 Rosenwald schools. Most counties, I think in North Carolina, I'm doing this, I'm remembering this off the top of my head, but I'm directionally correct. Of the counties in North Carolina that had Rosenwald schools, and something like 2/3 of all counties in North Carolina had Rosenwald schools, the average number of schools was 8 per county. Why is that? It's because the African American communities were not afforded school buses. The school buses are what enable larger, consolidated, better facilities, and the African American students are walking to these schools. And so what ends up happening is in 1928, when the Rosenwald School program pivots from creating really a focus of new schools to creating educational outcomes, that's when they start saying we need brick structures. That's when they start incentivizing a longer school year. That's when they start funding libraries. And that's when they start funding school buses. But that doesn't come until 1928.
My last question, I'm curious because I haven't actually gotten to look at the book yet, but where were the other 2 schools in Missouri? What parts of the state?
I don't know off the top of my head, and I could find out, and I could let you know. There's the archives of the Rosenwald Fund. The Rosenwald funds a large chunk of the history of Rosenwald Schools. The program is run out of Nashville, and as a result, the archives of the Rosenwald Schools end up at this university. And there's an online database that you can search on Missouri and find out exactly. It's all by county, and it's all tracked by county because the money flowed through the county school boards, right? But off the top of my head, I don't remember.
That's fine.
And Shane, if there's no more questions from the audience at the moment, like I would love to ask one more as well.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Andrew, can you tell us what happened to Rosenwald Schools? At the top of the conversation, we talked about how there was the Freedmen's Bureau and they had schools, but then when the compromise in 1877 happened, those were taken away. And so Rosenwald's responding to this, and we know that things are always responding to these external social and political forces. What happens where the Rosenwald schools are defunct and redundant and end?
Yeah. So some of them are outgrown because they are small and the communities will build larger schools. That happens sometimes in advance of the Brown v. Board desegregation orders of 1954 and 1955. The Brown v. Board desegregation orders come down, and the reaction varies widely by jurisdiction. In fact, if you look at in this work, the individual images of the individual schools there's a certain nomenclature to the titles. There's the name of the school because the names are reflective of the local community and what they chose because the local Black community named their schools. Then there's the county and the state because the money flowed through the county school systems. Then there's the opening year, but I also put the closing year because it's a way of illustrating exactly what you're asking, Lauren, this idea of, well, what happened to these schools, right? A number of them in certain jurisdictions, the response to Brown v. Board varies not just by state, but by local jurisdiction. Some of these schools closed in the 1950s, and we have school integration. But there are a number of these Rosenwald schools that are actively in segregated schools into the late 1960s. And then some actually become integrated schools.
Okay.
Some of the bigger ones. But largely, even when you had a nice school, when you finally get integration, that was the black children who went to the white schools because the white families didn't want to send their children to schools that were considered black schools. And so these schools largely fall out of use. It's why only 500 of the original 4,978 schools survive. It's why only half of those have been restored. And it's why we have this historic moment now. And let me just add one other thing. I think it's important. There is now an effort to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park that would have its headquarters in Chicago in a building with a historical tie to Julius Rosenwald. And then each state that had Rosenwald schools would designate certain schools that will become a part of this multi-site National Historical Park. And if this does happen, it will be the first element of the National Park Service to honor a Jewish American. And the legislation passed Congress late last year to direct the Secretary of the Interior to do a feasibility study of this. And I believe, and I have been recently invited onto the advisory board, and I believe that this will happen because the people that are leading this effort are dogged and have a wonderful track record in civic activism. And so I think that will then help bring further attention to this story and create schools all across these 15 states that people can visit and further learn this history.
That's exciting.
It is.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for this incredible conversation. I'm so happy that we had especially one celebrity in the audience as well. But really just thank you for the book. Thank you for the conversation. And I really am happy that we were able to have you on for an event today. So thank you.
Thanks for having Sean, Lauren. It's always a joy to be with you and Shane.
Yes.
And to
Thank
Left
you so
Bank
much
folks.
for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, and we thank you for all you're doing to keep literature and literacy alive in community engagement in St. Louis.
Yeah, happy to help with this community engagement and fostering this support for civic activism. There we go. Those are the words I'm looking for. But really, just thank you all, audience. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you again really soon.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
good
much.
night. Thanks.
Bye-bye.